Early one morning, Jerry was driving his daughters, Rachel and Connie, to school. The highway was clogged with traffic, the radio murmured updates about the world, and the girls sang cheerfully in the back seat. At home, Jerry was a loving husband and father, teasing his wife Karen and promising the kids a big pancake breakfast soon. That morning's news mentioned unusual rabies outbreaks spreading overseas. Jerry listened more closely, uneasy. Suddenly, a police cruiser tore past him, clipping his side mirror before vanishing ahead. Startled, he stepped out to inspect the damage only to see several more squad cars racing by in a frantic rush. Moments later, a deafening explosion ripped through a nearby building. An officer shouted for him to get back into his vehicle immediately. Before he could fully react, a runaway truck barreled toward him, slamming him aside. Dazed but conscious, Jerry realized this was no ordinary emergency. As a former United Nations investigator, his instincts warned him that something catastrophic was unfolding. He jumped back into the car and sped off, following the cleared path left behind by the chaos. Inside the vehicle, fear overtook Rachel, triggering a severe asthma attack. As Jerry tried to calm her, disaster struck again. An ambulance crashed into their car, flipping it over. The impact left Jerry and Karen momentarily stunned, but miraculously the family survived. Outside, however, the world had changed. People were attacking one another in a frenzy, biting and clawing like wild animals. Victims rose again moments later, transformed into violent, mindless creatures. The street had become a living nightmare. Acting quickly, Jerry grabbed Connie while Karen shielded Rachel. They spotted an abandoned RV nearby with keys still in the ignition. Just as they climbed in, several infected charged toward them. Karen fought one off while Jerry swerved sharply to knock another aside. They barely escaped the city's collapse. Within minutes, the infection had consumed Pennsylvania. Determined to put distance between them and the devastation, Jerry drove into the countryside. Rachel's breathing worsened, forcing them to stop. That's when Jerry received a call from Thierry, an old colleague who now served as the UNS Deputy Secretary General. Thierry promised a helicopter evacuation by nightfall, though it was clear even he didn't fully grasp the scale of the disaster. Their immediate concern was Rachel's inhaler. Jerry located a supermarket in a nearby town, but inside it was chaos. Desperate shoppers fought over dwindling supplies. The family split up. Jerry searched for medicine with Rachel, while Karen and Connie gathered food. Suddenly, Connie screamed. Two men were assaulting Karen, trying to steal their supplies. Jerry rushed in. When one of the attackers pulled a gun, Jerry acted without hesitation. The confrontation ended with 2 shots fired and the threat neutralized. A police officer witnessed the scene, but instead of intervening, he ignored Jerry's explanation and began looting shelves himself. The family fled the store, only to discover their RV had been stolen. Jerry contacted Thierry again and learned the helicopter wouldn't arrive until morning. They were instructed to shelter in a nearby apartment building. As they approached the location, another explosion thundered nearby. Without warning, an infected body crashed onto their car from above. A swarm followed, sprinting unnaturally fast toward them. Jerry ushered his family into the apartment building just in time, barricading themselves in the stairwell as the infected poured in behind them. Fighting their way upward, they narrowly avoided being overwhelmed. In desperation, they forced entry into an apartment occupied by a terrified but uninfected man. He allowed them to stay the night. By morning, Jerry urged the man to join them for the helicopter extraction, but he refused, convinced that stepping outside meant certain death. Jerry didn't press him. Instead, he improvised crude weapons from whatever he could find. As dawn broke, they moved quietly toward the rooftop. The stairwell was eerily silent until an infected lunged from the shadows. Jerry fired, dropping it instantly. The gunshot echoed through the building. Within seconds, the infected swarmed toward them. Panic erupted. Jerry fought desperately, swinging and firing to clear a path while Karen and the girls pushed ahead. But the horde was relentless and far too many. Within moments, Jerry was knocked flat onto the concrete. One of the infected pinned him down, and as he struggled, dark blood from the creature splattered into his mouth. Certain this was the end, he braced himself. A gunshot rang out. The creature collapsed. Standing nearby was Tommy, the young boy from the apartment. After Jerry's family had left, the infected broke into the building. Tommy was the only survivor who managed to slip away and follow them. They rushed to the rooftop. Karen ignited a flare, its red glow slicing through the smoke-filled sky. The rescue helicopter spotted the signal almost immediately. As they waited, Jerry stepped aside and quietly began counting to 12 in his head, watching for symptoms. He had learned the infection turned victims in seconds. He reached 12. Nothing happened. Relief washed over him. The helicopter touched down just as a wave of infected burst onto the rooftop. Two soldiers leaned out and opened fire, holding the horde back. Jerry seized the moment and sprinted forward, climbing aboard under heavy gunfire. Flames spread across the rooftop below as the aircraft lifted off. From the window, Jerry watched the city burn. He understood then this wasn't a local crisis. It was the collapse of civilization. They were transported to a U.S. Navy vessel stationed in the Atlantic, now functioning as both military command and refugee sanctuary. After reuniting his family in a temporary living area, Jerry met with Thierry. The news was grim. The U.S. president and much of the military leadership were gone. Governments worldwide had fallen. The infection had reached pandemic levels, spreading faster than anyone anticipated. Air travel was the only remaining global link, but scientists still didn't understand the pathogen. The only meaningful lead was a message from Camp Humphreys in South Korea, the first report to label the infected as zombies. Thierry explained that identifying the source could be humanity's only hope. If they could secure samples and data, a vaccine might be possible. He asked Jerry to accompany a virologist, Dr. Fastback, to investigate. Jerry refused. He had already given his life to international crises. Now he only wanted to protect his wife and daughters. But the naval commander made the situation clear. If Jerry declined, his family would be relocated off the ship to make room for others. Faced with that ultimatum, Jerry reluctantly agreed. Karen encouraged him through tears, telling him to come back. The girls clung to him tightly before he boarded a military plane bound for South Korea. They landed at night at a seemingly abandoned military base. The eerie silence told them everything. They were too late. Without warning, infected figures stormed out of the darkness. Soldiers were overwhelmed in seconds. Dr. Fastback panicked and tried to flee, but he tripped. His weapon discharged accidentally, killing him instantly. The shock froze Jerry in place. Reinforcements arrived just in time. Captain Speak ordered an immediate retreat. There was no room for hesitation. Jerry followed the squad, fighting their way back to safety. With the virologist dead, the responsibility now fell on Jerry. Captain Speak briefed him on what they had learned. The infected were drawn aggressively to sound. Shooting their bodies did little. Only headshots stopped them completely. Speak led Jerry to what remained of the base laboratory. It had been burned to the ground. On a nearby cot lay the charred remains of a military doctor, the second known infection. He had been examining the first victim when the corpse suddenly reanimated. Unprepared, the doctor was bitten and unknowingly carried the virus back into the camp, triggering the outbreak. Yet the origin of the infection was still unknown. There was another strange detail. During the attack, one injured soldier, limping badly, had been completely ignored by the infected, even though he stood exposed among them. Everyone had assumed it was luck. Then a prisoner spoke up. 2 weeks before the global collapse, Israel had begun constructing a massive 300-foot wall along its borders. They must have known something was coming. The name Jurgen Warmbrunn surfaced, a man in Jerusalem who might have answers. Whether the lead was solid or not, Jerry decided to follow it himself. But first, they needed to refuel the aircraft. The route to the runway was crawling with infected. Any sudden noise could trigger disaster. Captain Speak ordered complete silence and maximum caution. To avoid drawing attention, Jerry and the pilot, Gregory, used bicycles to quietly approach the plane. They were nearly there when suddenly, Jerry's satellite phone rang. Karen was calling. The sharp ringtone shattered the silence. Heads turned in the darkness, and the infected began to move. The soldiers hidden nearby immediately opened fire, buying Jerry and Gregory precious seconds. Captain Speak managed to complete the refueling just in time, but during the assault, he was bitten. Jerry made it onto the aircraft, yet none of the remaining troops survived the onslaught. After hours in the air, the plane finally descended toward Jerusalem. Once Jerry identified himself to air traffic control, officials escorted him to meet Jurgen Warmbrunn. Wasting no time, Jerry explained the global collapse and the desperate need for answers. Warmbrunn responded bluntly. Israel had intercepted fragments of an encrypted intelligence report suggesting that India was battling large-scale zombie outbreaks. Though the information was unverified, Israel operated under the 10th man rule. If 9 analysts agreed something was unlikely, the 10th was required to assume it was true and prepare for the worst. Warmbrunn had been that 10th man. So he ordered construction of the massive defensive wall. He later brought Jerry to the perimeter. Inside, Jerusalem appeared calm and orderly. Refugees were being processed and given shelter. It seemed like a rare pocket of stability. But beyond the wall, the reality was horrifying. From above, thousands upon thousands of infected swarmed around the barrier, writhing like a living sea. Just when it seemed the city might hold, a strange shift rippled through the horde. They began moving in unison toward one section of the wall. Inside the city, refugees were celebrating their survival. Some were singing joyfully into microphones, their amplified voices echoing outward. They didn't realize the sound was acting like a beacon. Drawn by the noise, the infected surged forward. They began climbing over one another, forming a grotesque, writhing tower of bodies that scaled the massive wall with terrifying speed. Jerry shouted warnings, but it was too late. The infected poured over the barrier like a collapsing avalanche. Celebration turned into chaos within seconds. Soldiers fired relentlessly, but bullets barely made a dent against the sheer numbers. The so-called impregnable fortress fell in minutes. Civilians scattered in every direction. Amid the panic, Jerry noticed something unsettling. The infected bypassed an elderly man entirely. They also ignored a frail, undernourished boy who couldn't even run. There was no time to analyze it. Jerry and a small group took shelter inside a nearby residential building. Moments later, they were trapped from both ends of a hallway. During the struggle, a female soldier named Sejin was bitten on the wrist while defending Jerry. Without hesitation, Jerry grabbed a blade and severed her arm above the bite. It was brutal, but it worked. The infection didn't spread. A rescue helicopter arrived outside. Jerry helped Sejin toward it, but the infected launched themselves at the aircraft. In seconds, the chopper spun out of control and exploded midair. The airfield was packed with terrified civilians. The original pilot fled. Jerry arrived just in time to see the plane he had come on lifting off without him. Desperate, Jerry and Sejin forced another departing passenger jet to stop. Using the emergency ladder near the cockpit, they climbed aboard. Inside, passengers stared out the windows in horror. Jerry followed their gaze. Thousands of infected were overwhelming those left behind on the runway. It looked like the end of the world. He steadied himself and rewrapped Sejin's wound. As he stared at her severed arm, memories flashed. The limping soldier in Korea, the elderly man, the starving boy. A realization sparked. He contacted Thierry immediately, explaining he might have discovered a pattern, something that could change the fight. But he needed access to a World Health Organization facility to test his theory. Using his authority, Thierry persuaded the pilot to reroute the aircraft to Cardiff, Wales, where a WHO research center was located. Hours later, Jerry was jolted awake by frantic barking from a small dog in the cabin. A confused flight attendant opened a storage compartment. An infected lunged out. Panic erupted instantly. Jerry pulled back a curtain and froze at the sight spreading through the plane. He motioned for silence and grabbed a carry-on bag, attempting to block the narrow aisle. Other passengers helped, stacking luggage to form a barrier. Then someone dropped a suitcase. The noise echoed sharply. The infected turned toward them. Within seconds, the makeshift wall collapsed. Jerry fought back with whatever he could grab. Screams filled the cramped cabin as chaos consumed the aircraft. Realizing they were losing control, Jerry pulled a grenade from Sejin's belt. Without hesitation, he hurled it toward the plane's right side. The explosion tore a massive hole in the fuselage. The explosion sucked several infected straight out of the aircraft, but it also crippled the engine. The immediate threat was gone, yet now the plane was spiraling out of control. Jerry rushed to Sejin, secured her seatbelt tightly, and braced himself. The aircraft plunged downward, shaking violently before smashing into the ground with a deafening impact. The fuselage split apart on contact. Everything went dark. When Jerry regained consciousness, he was still strapped to his seat, surrounded by twisted metal and scattered debris. A sharp, burning pain shot through his abdomen. Looking down, he saw a metal shard impaled through his torso. He resisted the urge to pull it out. Then he heard movement behind him. Against all odds, Sejin had survived. Supporting one another, they staggered toward the nearby WHO research facility. Jerry barely made it to the entrance before collapsing. When he woke again, days had passed. Far away, aboard the UN command ship, news arrived that Jerry's plane had crashed. With resources stretched thin, the naval commander ordered Karen, the girls, and Tommy transferred to a refugee camp in Nova Scotia. When Jerry learned what had happened, anger surged through him. He had risked everything, and this was the reward. But even through his fury, he stayed focused. There was still work to finish. He shared his observations with the WHO doctors, the limping soldier in Korea, the elderly man in Jerusalem, the sickly child. The infected had ignored them all. Jerry believed the virus was selective. It targeted strong, healthy hosts to maximize its spread. Those who appeared weak or terminally ill were bypassed. What seemed random was actually the infection's vulnerability. If a person could convincingly mimic severe illness, the infected might overlook them entirely. The idea stunned the room. To test the theory, they needed access to live pathogens stored in the high-security fur laboratory across the campus. But that building had been overrun. Any noise would draw death. Still, there was no alternative. Equipped with minimal protective gear, Jerry, Sejin, and a WHO doctor entered a connecting tunnel. They moved cautiously, weapons ready, stepping over signs of violent struggle. As they neared the containment area, dormant, infected figures lay scattered across the floor. Then the doctor accidentally knocked over a metal cabinet. The crash echoed. An infected jolted awake. Sejin reacted instantly, firing a precise headshot, but the gunshot shattered the fragile silence. From every corridor, infected surged toward them. They ran. To give the others a chance, Jerry broke away, smashing a metal bar against the stairwell railing to draw the horde toward him. He darted into a side lab, using doorframes and tight corners to slow his pursuers. Meanwhile, Sejin and the doctor barely made it back toward the safe wing. Infected poured in behind them. At the last possible second, they slipped through a reinforced door, and colleagues slammed it shut. Jerry pressed onward alone. Most of the infected had followed the noise, leaving the first storage area eerily quiet. Inside, rows of labeled and unlabeled pathogens lined refrigerated units. He stared at the vials. There was no way to know which disease would be severe enough to fool the infection without killing him outright. Time was running out. He gathered as many samples as he could into a container. When he turned to leave, an infected stood blocking the exit, staring at him from across the glass. There was only one option left. Jerry picked up a syringe. His hands trembled as he selected an unmarked pathogen at random. Before injecting himself, he recorded a final message to the camera, just in case. Then he pressed the needle into his arm. Seconds stretched into eternity. He waited for fever, convulsions, anything. Clutching the box of samples, he triggered the door release. The infected moved. It walked straight past him, didn't even look twice. From behind the reinforced glass, the observing doctors burst into tears. The theory was correct. To prove it, Jerry stepped into the hallway and deliberately made noise, opening a drink, knocking objects over, shouting. The infected rushed toward him and ignored him completely. The weakness had been found. With Thierry's support, Jerry was reunited with his family. Using the discovered method, researchers developed camouflage vaccines derived from controlled pathogens. Doses were airlifted across continents. The war wasn't over, but humanity finally had a fighting chance. Analysis: what if the zombie apocalypse didn't start in one city? What if it started everywhere, all at once? Not slowly, not quietly, but in 12 seconds. This isn't your typical zombie story. When most films in this genre trap a small group of survivors in a farmhouse or a shopping mall, World War Z does something completely different. It zooms out, way out. This is not about surviving one night. It's about whether humanity itself has a future. And that's what makes this film stand out. Instead of focusing on gore or isolated horror, the movie throws us into global chaos. Governments collapsing, cities falling in minutes, entire countries overrun before they can even understand what's happening. The scale is overwhelming. The panic feels real. The urgency never slows down. But here's the twist. Our hero isn't a soldier with endless ammo. He isn't a scientist locked in a lab. He isn't even trying to save the world at first. He's just a father trying to protect his family. Brad Pitt's character, Jerry Lane, is a former UN investigator, not the loud, reckless action hero we usually see in outbreak movies. He doesn't fight the zombies head-on. He studies them, he observes patterns, he asks questions. While the world reacts with fear, he reacts with analysis. And that shift changes everything, because World War Z isn't really about killing zombies, it's about understanding them. It blends large-scale disaster filmmaking with pulse-pounding horror. One moment you're watching traffic gridlock in Philadelphia, the next, you're witnessing walls being climbed by a living tidal wave of infected bodies. The tension is relentless, the movement is fast, the danger feels unstoppable, and if you're expecting slow, stumbling zombies, forget it. These infected don't walk, they sprint, they swarm, they climb over each other like a single organism. It's terrifying not because it's bloody, but because it feels possible. So in this breakdown, we're going to explore why World War Z became one of the biggest zombie films ever made, what it does differently from every other outbreak movie, and why its ending might be smarter than most people realize. Because sometimes the scariest apocalypse is the one that feels like it could actually happen. Before we dive deeper into the chaos, let's step back and understand what World War Z actually is, and why it feels so different from other zombie films. Released in 2013, World War Z was directed by Mark Forster and stars Brad Pitt in the lead role. But this isn't just another horror movie with a big-name actor attached. It's a full-scale global disaster thriller disguised as a zombie film, and that distinction matters. At its core, the movie blends multiple genres: action, horror, political thriller, and large-scale catastrophe cinema. It has the intensity of a war film, the urgency of a pandemic thriller, and the tension of survival horror, all wrapped into one relentless narrative. But what truly sets it apart is its global perspective. Instead of staying confined to one town or one group of survivors, the story moves across continents. We begin in Philadelphia, where normal life shatters within minutes. Then we travel to South Korea, where early clues about the outbreak emerge. We move to Jerusalem, where an entire nation prepares behind towering walls. And finally, we reach Wales, inside a World Health Organization research facility, humanity's last fragile hope. This constant shift in location makes the film feel massive. The threat isn't local, it isn't regional, it's planetary, and the premise is simple but terrifying. A mysterious infection begins spreading at lightning speed. Anyone bitten transforms within seconds into a hyper-aggressive, mindless attacker. There's no slow decay, no dramatic transformation, just instant collapse of society. Governments fail, communication breaks down. Entire cities fall before anyone can understand what's happening. At the center of it all is Jerry Lane, a former United Nations investigator pulled back into action, not because he wants to save the world, but because his family's survival depends on it. His mission isn't to fight the infected, it's to find the origin, because in a crisis this big, understanding the cause might be the only way to stop the collapse, and that's the foundation of World War Z. Not just a fight for survival, but a race for answers. As we move into the deeper layers of this film, keep this in mind. This isn't a story about hiding from monsters. It's about chasing a solution before time runs out. Now let's talk about what World War Z is really about, beyond the running, the chaos, and the infected swarms. Because on the surface, yes, it's a zombie movie, but underneath, it's a pandemic thriller, it's a political drama, it's a survival story about adaptation, and that layered identity is what gives the film its edge. First, the obvious theme, global pandemic fear. This isn't a slow-burning outbreak. It spreads in seconds. Entire cities collapse before officials can even hold a press conference. Airports, military bases, governments, none of them are prepared. The movie taps into one of humanity's deepest modern anxieties. What happens when the system fails? There are no safe zones, no gradual warning period, just instant chaos. And that chaos feels disturbingly realistic. But the second theme is more personal, survival versus responsibility. Jerry Lane doesn't volunteer to save the world out of heroism. He's pulled back into service because his family's safety depends on it. Every decision he makes isn't just about humanity, it's about his wife and daughters waiting on a ship in the middle of the ocean. That emotional anchor keeps the story grounded. Without it, this would just be spectacle. With it, it becomes human. Then there's the most interesting theme of all, adaptation over domination. Most outbreak films end with brute force, bombs, bullets, or total destruction. But World War Z suggests something smarter. The key to survival isn't overpowering the threat, it's understanding it. The infected aren't mindless in the traditional sense. They follow patterns. They respond to stimuli. They behave almost like a hive. And once Jerry realizes that, the fight shifts from physical to strategic. That shift changes the tone of the movie. Emotionally, the film is tense, urgent, and relentless. There's almost no breathing room. The pacing mirrors the outbreak itself, fast, aggressive, overwhelming. But interestingly, it avoids excessive gore. This isn't horror built on shock value. It's horror built on speed and scale. So who is this movie really for? It's for viewers who love large-scale disaster films, for fans of high-stakes thrillers, for those who prefer intelligent solutions over mindless action. If you're looking for deep character drama like long-running survival series, this may not fully satisfy you. But if you want intensity, urgency, and the feeling that the world is collapsing in real time, this movie delivers. Because at its heart, World War Z isn't just about zombies. It's about how humanity reacts when time runs out, and whether we're smart enough to adapt before we're wiped out. Let's break down the full story of World War Z, step by step, and see how the world falls in a matter of days. The film opens on an ordinary morning in Philadelphia. Traffic, kids arguing in the backseat, news reports playing in the background about strange outbreaks overseas. Nothing feels urgent yet, just distant unrest. And then it happens, a police motorcycle crashes, an explosion echoes through the city, people start running. Within seconds, chaos erupts. We witness something terrifying. Anyone bitten transforms in about 12 seconds, no slow decay. No dramatic buildup, just instant, violent change. Society collapses in real time. Cars crash, buildings burn, streets flood with panic. Jerry Lane manages to escape with his wife and daughters, barely surviving wave after wave of infected. They eventually find temporary refuge, but it's clear the outbreak isn't local. It's global. Soon, Jerry is extracted by U.S. military forces, but there's a catch. His family will only remain protected if he agrees to help investigate the source of the outbreak. Reluctantly, he accepts. The mission becomes clear: find patient zero. His first stop is South Korea, where a military base may hold clues. There, they discover that the infection might have originated in Asia, possibly spreading faster than anyone predicted. The tension escalates when infected over on the base, killing key personnel and forcing Jerry to escape once again. Next stop, Jerusalem. Here, something shocking has happened. Israel anticipated the outbreak early and built massive walls around the city, sealing themselves off. For a moment, it feels like humanity has found a strategy, but then comes one of the film's most unforgettable scenes. Celebrations inside the city create noise. The infected, drawn by sound, swarm the outer walls. Instead of mindlessly attacking, they begin climbing over each other, forming a towering human pyramid that spills over the barrier like a tidal wave. Jerusalem falls. The scale of infection now feels unstoppable. Jerry barely escapes and boards a plane, but even that safety is short-lived. An infected passenger causes chaos mid-flight, leading to a desperate crash landing in Wales. Now injured and exhausted, Jerry reaches a World Health Organization facility, humanity's last line of defense. And here's where the story shifts. Up until now, everyone has been reacting. Now, Jerry starts observing. He remembers something. During the chaos, he noticed zombies ignoring certain individuals, the elderly, the weak, the visibly sick. That observation becomes the key. Inside the lab, surrounded by infected specimens, Jerry realizes the virus doesn't attack those who are already terminally ill. It seeks healthy hosts. It spreads efficiently. It avoids defective bodies. So he makes a radical decision. He injects himself with a deadly but curable pathogen, deliberately making himself appear sick. And then he walks out into a hallway full of infected. They ignore him. That moment changes everything. The solution isn't annihilation, it's camouflage. The world doesn't end with a final battle. It ends with a discovery, a fragile strategy that allows humanity to fight back. And just like that, the war shifts. Not over, not won, but survivable. That's the full journey of World War Z, a race across continents, driven not by brute strength, but by one man's ability to notice what everyone else missed. Now let's talk about that ending, because World War Z doesn't end the way most zombie movies do. There's no giant final explosion, no heroic last stand, no complete eradication of the infected. Instead, the climax happens in silence. Inside the World Health Organization facility in Wales, Jerry Lane makes a discovery that changes the entire war. Throughout the film, he noticed something strange. The infected ignore certain people. The elderly, the weak, the terminally ill. At first, it seems random, but it's not. The virus doesn't want a dying host. It spreads fast, aggressively, but strategically. It chooses healthy bodies to maximize transmission. In a twisted way, the infected aren't mindless monsters. They're operating on biological efficiency. And that realization leads to the film's boldest moment. Jerry deliberately injects himself with a deadly but curable pathogen. He makes himself appear sick, infected, but not by the zombie virus. Then he walks out into a corridor filled with infected. They don't attack him. They don't even see him as prey. He's invisible. That's the breakthrough. Humanity doesn't defeat the outbreak with bullets. It doesn't wipe out the infected. Instead, it adapts. It learns the enemy's weakness and uses it. The solution becomes camouflage, controlled infection, with non-lethal diseases to make soldiers and civilians temporarily invisible to the swarm. It's risky. It's imperfect. But it works, and that's the key message of the ending. This isn't a victory story. It's a survival story. The war isn't over. The infected still exist. The world is still shattered. But now humanity has something it didn't have before: leverage. Symbolically, the ending suggests something powerful. When faced with unstoppable chaos, brute force may fail. But intelligence, observation, and adaptation can tip the scale. There's also an open-ended feeling. Civilization isn't restored overnight. There's no happily ever after. Instead, we're left with a fragile new balance. Humans must live smarter, move carefully, understand the threat instead of simply attacking it. It's a surprisingly cerebral ending for a blockbuster of this scale, and maybe that's why it lingers. Because instead of asking, can we destroy the monsters, it asks something far more unsettling. Can we evolve fast enough to survive them? Now here's where World War Z gets even more interesting. Because beneath all the chaos, the swarms, and the global panic, there are subtle details most viewers completely miss. And once you notice them, the movie becomes smarter than it first appears. Let's start with one of the most important ideas in the film, the 10th man doctrine. In Jerusalem, we learn that Israel built massive defensive walls because of this policy. The idea is simple. If 9 experts agree something won't happen, the 10th person must argue that it will, no matter how unlikely. It's a strategy designed to prevent groupthink. Symbolically, this is the film's warning about complacency. The outbreak spread so fast partly because the world didn't want to believe it could happen. Governments ignored early signs. News reports were brushed aside. The crisis didn't become real until it was too late. The 10th man represents preparedness in a world that prefers comfort over caution. Now let's talk about the zombies themselves. These aren't slow, rotting corpses. They move like a swarm, fast, coordinated, almost insect-like. When they climb the walls of Jerusalem by piling on top of each other, it feels less like individuals attacking and more like a single organism acting with purpose. That's not random, it mirrors how pandemics behave. Viruses don't think, but they spread efficiently. The infected in this film operate like biology amplified. They're not evil, they're relentless. And then there's the theme of sound. Noise repeatedly triggers disaster. In Jerusalem, singing and celebration attract the swarm. On the airplane, a single infected passenger causes catastrophe. Inside the WHO lab, even a small slip or sound creates deadly tension. Silence equals survival. The world in World War Z becomes one where humanity must shrink, quiet down, and adapt, instead of dominating its environment. Even the opening scenes contain subtle foreshadowing. Early news reports mention strange outbreaks overseas. Quick background shots show social unrest and rising panic before the main characters even realize something is wrong. The warning signs were always there, we just didn't pay attention. And that's the real underlying message of the film. Disasters rarely come without clues. We ignore them, we underestimate them, and then we scramble to react. So while World War Z looks like a high-budget action thriller on the surface, underneath it's quietly asking a deeper question. Are we truly prepared for the threats we dismiss? Because sometimes the difference between survival and collapse is simply noticing what everyone else overlooks. Now let's go behind the scenes, because the real story of World War Z is almost as dramatic as the movie itself. First, many people don't realize this film is based on a book. It's inspired by World War Z, the 2006 novel by Max Brooks. But here's the twist, the movie and the book are completely different in structure and tone. The novel is written as a collection of interviews from survivors around the world, almost like a historical document of the apocalypse. The film, on the other hand, follows one central character on a continuous mission. In fact, many fans of the book were shocked by how much was changed, and that leads us to one of the most fascinating production stories. The original third act of the movie was completely scrapped. After early test screenings, the studio decided the ending didn't work. Massive reshoots were ordered. Entire sequences were rewritten and refilmed, including the intense World Health Organization lab finale we now know. That decision reportedly added tens of millions to the budget. Speaking of budget, World War Z became one of the most expensive zombie films ever made, with production costs exceeding $190 million. For a genre usually known for modest budgets, that was a huge gamble. At one point, industry insiders even predicted the film might become a disaster behind the scenes, but it didn't. Another interesting detail, Brad Pitt wasn't just the lead actor. He was also a producer on the film. That gave him major influence over the direction of the project, especially during those critical reshoots. And here's something subtle but impressive. The speed of infection, 12 seconds, was carefully calculated and consistently shown throughout the film. That tiny detail added realism and structure to the chaos. It wasn't random. It had rules. Filming the Jerusalem wall scene, where zombies form a massive human pyramid, required a combination of practical extras and heavy CGI. It became one of the film's most iconic visuals and one of the most technically challenging sequences to create. There were even talks of a sequel for years. Directors like David Fincher were briefly attached to continue the story. But despite the film's box office success, the sequel never materialized. So in many ways, World War Z is a miracle production, a troubled shoot, a rewritten ending, a massive budget risk. And yet, it became one of the highest-grossing zombie films in history. Sometimes, the real survival story isn't just on screen. It's behind the camera. To truly understand World War Z, we need to see where it stands in the zombie genre. Because this movie didn't arrive in a vacuum. It stepped into a world already shaped by classics and cult favorites, and then tried to do something bigger. Let's start with 28 Days Later. That film redefined zombies for modern audiences by introducing fast-moving infected. It was gritty, intimate, and deeply character-driven. The horror felt personal, small groups, limited settings, emotional trauma front and center. World War Z takes the speed of 28 Days Later, but expands the scale. Instead of focusing on a handful of survivors, it zooms out to the collapse of entire nations. The fear isn't just, will I survive? It's, can humanity survive? Then there's The Walking Dead. That series is about long-term survival. It dives deep into character arcs, moral breakdown, and psychological tension over years. The zombies are often background pressure. The real threat is human nature. World War Z doesn't slow down long enough for that. It's about the outbreak phase, the moment society shatters. It captures the first wave of panic rather than the aftermath. Now compare it to I Am Legend. Both films follow a protagonist searching for a solution to a global infection. Both feature intense, isolated tension. But I Am Legend takes place after the world has already fallen. World War Z happens during the fall. That's a crucial difference. It shows governments reacting in real time, military strategies failing, borders collapsing. It feels like watching history break apart live. And here's what World War Z arguably does better than many of its genre rivals: scale. Very few zombie films attempt global storytelling on this level. The transitions between continents give it a sense of worldwide catastrophe that most survival stories don't attempt. But here's where it might do less: deep character exploration. Because the movie moves so quickly, side characters don't always get the development fans of slower-paced series might expect. So where does that leave it? World War Z isn't trying to be the most emotional zombie story. It isn't trying to be the most graphic. It isn't trying to be the darkest. It's trying to be the biggest, and in terms of sheer global intensity, it succeeds. In a genre full of intimate nightmares, World War Z delivers a planetary one. When World War Z was first announced, many people thought it would fail. A massive budget, production delays, expensive reshoots, a zombie genre that some believed was already saturated. Industry insiders were skeptical, but then the movie released and surprised almost everyone. At the box office, World War Z became a global hit. It earned over $500 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing zombie films ever made. For a genre usually associated with mid-budget horror, that was a huge achievement. Audiences showed up, and they showed up in large numbers. Now, what about critics? The response was generally positive, but not without criticism. Many reviewers praised the film's pacing, large-scale action, and global perspective. The Jerusalem Wall sequence and the relentless first act were widely highlighted as standout moments. Critics appreciated that the movie leaned more into thriller territory rather than excessive gore, but there were common complaints too. Some felt the emotional depth was lacking, supporting characters weren't explored enough. And fans of the original novel were disappointed by how drastically the story had changed from the source material. So was it a masterpiece? Not exactly. Was it a disaster? Definitely not. It landed somewhere in between, a strong, intelligent blockbuster that prioritized scale and momentum over deep character study. Interestingly, over time, appreciation for the film has grown. Especially after real-world global health crises, many viewers revisited World War Z and found its pandemic portrayal disturbingly realistic. The speed, the confusion, the initial disbelief. It felt less like fantasy and more like possibility. So is World War Z underrated? Not quite. It was commercially successful and generally well-reviewed, but it might be underappreciated for how smart its third act actually is. In a genre crowded with gore and shock value, World War Z chose intensity and strategy. And sometimes, that quieter intelligence leaves a stronger legacy than pure chaos. So after all the chaos, the global collapse, the swarming walls of infected, was World War Z worth it? Let's break it down. First, the strengths. This movie delivers relentless pacing. From the moment Philadelphia erupts, the tension barely lets go. There's a constant sense of urgency that keeps you locked in. It doesn't drag, it doesn't wander. It moves like the outbreak itself, fast and overwhelming. Second, scale. Very few zombie films attempt storytelling on a global level like this. Watching governments fall, borders fail, and entire cities crumble adds weight that smaller survival stories simply can't replicate. Third, the intelligence of its solution. Instead of ending with a giant explosion or last-minute miracle weapon, the film resolves its conflict through observation and adaptation. That choice alone elevates it above many genre entries. Now the weaknesses. Character development takes a back seat. Side characters appear and disappear quickly. Emotional arcs aren't deeply explored because the film prioritizes momentum. Also, if you're expecting intense gore or slow-building horror, you might find this approach more thriller than terror. And for fans of the original novel, the dramatic departure from the book's structure remains controversial. So who should watch this movie? If you love fast-paced disaster thrillers, this is for you. If you enjoy intelligent outbreak stories with global stakes, this is for you. If you prefer emotional, slow-burn survival dramas, this might not fully satisfy you. Overall, World War Z may not be the most emotionally profound zombie film ever made, but it might be one of the most ambitious. It redefined scale in the genre, it delivered blockbuster intensity, and it proved that sometimes, survival isn't about overpowering the enemy, it's about outsmarting it. final recommendation. Absolutely worth watching, especially if you want to experience what a worldwide apocalypse feels like in real time. Because in World War Z, the scariest part isn't just the infected, it's how fast the world can fall. REVIEWS, this stands as my second favorite end-of-the-world spectacle, right behind The Day After Tomorrow, an unconventional pick for the top spot, I admit. It shares little in common with World War Z, but taste isn't always logical. And this one, it's massive in scope. At the center is a man who excels at solving problems, though the film keeps his exact expertise deliberately vague. He's the kind of fixer organizations call when situations spiral beyond control. Working in a specialized role for the United Nations, he's accustomed to stepping into chaos. But when we meet him, he's walked away from it all, choosing family over crisis management. Of course, peace is short-lived. Within minutes, the world fractures. Without warning, cities descend into hysteria as a new breed of infected storms the streets. These aren't the slow, stumbling undead of old cinema. They're swift, relentless, and frighteningly coordinated, more like swarming insects than corpses. Their instinct to spread is terrifyingly efficient. One bite is all it takes. Civilization doesn't collapse gradually, it detonates. Nature's revenge arrives with terrifying speed, and suddenly this feels like one of the most ambitious zombie films ever mounted. If zombie stories were an umbrella category, it would be the most flexible in cinema, stretching from grim horror to outright comedy. The genre keeps evolving, mutating like the creatures it portrays. Warm Bodies even ventured into romantic territory, blending the macabre with Shakespearean longing. Meanwhile, the genre has climbed from low-budget cult roots into full-scale blockbuster territory. It takes someone like Brad Pitt to anchor that transformation, and reportedly, it took him years to bring this project to life. Though surrounded by a sizable cast, this is fundamentally his show. He plays a UN investigator racing across continents in search of patient zero, and hopefully, a cure. Blink and you'll miss it. The opening traffic jam erupts into sheer pandemonium before the audience has time to breathe. What starts as an ordinary gridlock morphs into a stampede of terror in seconds. After a heart-pounding escape, he and his family are evacuated to a floating military command center, a fleet of warships serving as humanity's last organized foothold. From there, he's dispatched around the globe on a desperate mission. That's the backbone of the film, though the specifics are best experienced firsthand. Now, about the infected themselves. Visually, they're less grotesque than many of their cinematic predecessors. In fact, in the right lighting, they could almost blend into a rush-hour subway crowd. There's surprisingly little gore. What makes them horrifying isn't appearance, it's velocity and sound. They strike with lightning speed, accompanied by sudden, overwhelming waves of noise that jolt your nerves before your brain can react. One standout sequence involves towering defensive walls around Jerusalem, imagery that inevitably recalls similar fortifications in Game of Thrones and even echoes design elements from Warm Bodies. The spectacle is undeniable. Performance-wise, Pitt shoulders nearly everything. The supporting players rarely leave a lasting imprint. Mireille Enos portrays his wife, largely confined to phone conversations after the explosive opening, leaving you wishing she had more presence. In contrast, Daniella Kert appears more prominently as a disciplined Israeli soldier who becomes his capable field companion. The film launches with tremendous promise, but somewhere along the way, the spectacle starts to feel overly dependent on CGI. It's almost as if it arrived a few weeks before it was truly finished, an ironic thought given how long it reportedly took to produce. Fans of World War Z by Max Brooks may find themselves particularly conflicted. Aside from the title, the connection is faint. Even the nature of the infected differs drastically. These creatures don't shuffle, they sprint. They don't linger to feed, they bite and move on. They scale walls, they select targets. They resemble the infected from 28 Days Later, or the crazy's more than traditional undead lore. Yet those films offered layered characters, visceral horror, and unflinching brutality. Here, the emphasis leans heavily toward action. Character depth thins, the terror feels diluted. Personally, I'm drawn more to stories where the undead rise inexplicably, and the true drama lies in how survivors retain their humanity. That's part of why The Walking Dead feels more unsettling, because no matter how fiercely you resist, infection is inevitable. Fate catches everyone eventually. This film, by contrast, opts for a tone that softens the blow. A grittier, R-rated cut might have amplified its impact. Instead, the conclusion leans toward reassurance rather than dread. While I understand that the book's structure, episodic and journalistic, was difficult to translate directly to screen, it's disappointing how little of its grounded, methodical realism was adapted. Especially when the novel's solution to the crisis felt practical and believable, whereas the film's chosen method borders on scientific fantasy. It leaves you wondering whether this story deserves a serialized reimagining, something slower, darker, more faithful. Because beneath the glossy action and global set pieces lies a concept that could have been far more haunting. And just when you think humanity has found its answer, another unsettling question begins to surface. Trying to compress that novel into a single 2-hour feature was an impossible mission from the start. World War Z wasn't a traditional narrative. It was a mosaic of interviews, fragmented testimonies, and standalone survival accounts. Since there wasn't a singular storyline to adapt, the filmmakers essentially borrowed the premise and constructed an entirely new plot around it. Fair enough, but they left so much untapped. Imagine the underwater hordes drifting across ocean floors, the abandoned ships filled with infected at sea, the devastating Battle of Yonkers. The slow, disciplined military strategy that gradually reclaimed territory, far more believable than the film's eyebrow-raising, zombie camouflage concept, or the chilling perspective from the International Space Station, watching the planet fall in silence. Even the origins of Patient Zero could have anchored the story in something more grounded. The source material offered a treasure trove, yet the film extracted only fragments. The novel thrived on themes like bureaucratic incompetence, denial, isolationism, and sharp social commentary. Those layers gave the outbreak weight beyond spectacle. In contrast, the film narrows its lens to Jerry Lane, the globetrotting UN investigator played by Brad Pitt. We hop from South Korea to the UK to Israel, glimpsing how different nations respond. That global scope is intriguing. Israel constructing a 200-foot wall in a matter of days is visually impressive, but plausibility begins to wobble. With civilization collapsing, commercial flights somehow remain operational. Billions are dead, yet air travel persists just long enough for our hero to crisscross continents. A grenade detonates inside a plane mid-flight, causing explosive decompression, yet it still manages a survivable crash landing. Suspension of disbelief can only stretch so far before it snaps. Director Mark Forster crafts several nail-biting sequences, no doubt. The tension spikes effectively at times. But supporting characters, especially military personnel, are dispatched so quickly that emotional investment barely has time to form. Outside of Jerry, few figures linger in memory. And even Jerry himself feels almost too composed. In the face of a global extinction event, he rarely cracks. No breakdown, no raw human moment of terror. One scene of genuine fear could have added dimension, but instead, he remains unshakably steady. Oddly enough, the emotional core established in the opening act, his bond with his family, fades once he leaves them behind. Those first 30-35 minutes are gripping. They feel authentic, intimate. After that separation, something weakens. Perhaps keeping his family closer to the narrative might have deepened the stakes instead of sending him on a fuel-burning world tour. Visually, the experience isn't flawless either. Several night sequences are murky, and even daylight scenes struggle with clarity as the infected swarm at breakneck speed. The frantic camera work and rapid cuts make some action moments blur together. The 3D presentation adds little, and the shaky cinematography can verge on disorienting. Considering the well-documented rewrites and reshoots, it's clear the production faced turbulence. So was it worth it? It's acceptable, not groundbreaking. For me, it felt like staring at an anthill in chaos, fascinating for a moment, then oddly irritating. Casual viewers might be thrilled, especially given how zombie stories have surged in popularity since The Walking Dead became a cultural phenomenon. But as a longtime fan of the genre, I expected more bite. There's little controversy, little depth. It plays things safe, a polished popcorn spectacle rather than a bold reinvention. Decent is the word that keeps coming to mind. These infected aren't the shambling relics of old-school horror. They're hyper-aggressive, erratic, twitching with unsettling convulsions, yet their speed almost works against them. The film moves so fast that tension sometimes evaporates before it can fully form. What made George Romero's original Dead trilogy so enduring was its patience, its willingness to let dread simmer. Here, chaos dominates. The airplane sequence is undeniably thrilling, one of the film's strongest moments. But outside of that high point, I kept waiting for the story to either slow down and breathe or surge forward with renewed urgency. Instead, the middle stretch drifts, caught between momentum and stagnation. Action overload in some scenes, sluggish pacing in others, and for a zombie film, the absence of gore is striking. The carnage rarely lingers long enough to unsettle. It just flashes by, as if afraid to fully commit, leaving you wondering whether the real outbreak wasn't on screen, but somewhere behind the scenes where a very different version of this story might still be clawing to get out. When it comes to performances, Brad Pitt delivers without hesitation. Whatever reservations I may have about the film itself, his work here is rock solid. He plays Jerry Lane with quiet determination, a man who doesn't crumble under pressure but sharpens because of it. I'm not usually his biggest admirer, yet in this role he fits seamlessly. He convinces as both crisis negotiator and devoted father, balancing resolve with restraint. Mireille Enos brings a subtle warmth to the role of Karen. Her performance feels grounded and sincere, never exaggerated. In fact, she's so effective in the early scenes that you can't help wishing the script gave her more to do. The emotional anchor she provides fades too quickly. The daughters, portrayed by Sterling Jarens and Abigail Hargrove, are equally impressive. Child performances can often feel forced, but here they're natural and endearing. Their chemistry with Pitt helps make the opening act genuinely immersive. Even David Morse, despite limited screen time, leaves a noticeable mark. Despite my criticisms, I did find the experience engaging overall. The pacing can feel hurried, yet the runtime moves briskly. It's far from flawless, but it rises above mediocrity. I wouldn't object to seeing Pitt return for another round in a potential sequel. As someone not particularly drawn to science fiction where antagonists lack awareness of their own monstrosity, I was cautiously optimistic given the names attached: Mark Forster, Max Brooks, Joe Carnahan, and Pitt. Thankfully, this isn't just a splatterfest of mindless gore. The infected don't dominate every frame, and the narrative hops across diverse international settings. Jerry's mission is framed with humanitarian stakes, though at times the moral messaging feels slightly overemphasized. Still, the film leans heavily on Pitt's presence. Supporting roles rarely break through, with the exception of Morse and Peter Capaldi. Logically speaking, Lane's family often feels like narrative leverage rather than necessity, and certain subplots could vanish without altering the central arc. Yet strong production values, sprawling locations, large-scale crowd scenes, and polished digital effects keep the script moving smoothly toward its predictable but satisfying conclusion. Fans of epic disaster spectacles will likely find themselves rooting for humanity while recoiling from the infected masses. It's fascinating how zombies have transformed over the decades. Once shambling and slow, easily dodged with a brisk jog or a well-aimed swing, they've evolved into something far more menacing. Danny Boyle accelerated that shift with 28 Days Later, redefining them as viral horrors rather than lumbering cadavers. Add the global popularity of The Walking Dead, and it's clear the undead are no longer niche, they're mainstream, worldwide. After years of development turmoil, rewrites, cast reshuffles, production hiccups, World War Z finally arrived. Given the complexity and satirical depth of Brooks' novel, adapting it into a blockbuster was always going to be challenging. Many expected a chaotic mess. Surprisingly, it's not. In fact, it's often relentlessly entertaining. The opening news footage foreshadowing disaster gives way to immediate chaos in Philadelphia. Jerry, Karen, and their daughters are caught in traffic when the outbreak detonates around them. A helicopter sent by Deputy Secretary General Umutoni, Fana Makona, rescues them to a naval vessel offshore. From there, Jerry is pressured into tracing the source of the contagion under the implicit threat that his family's safety depends on his cooperation. His journey spans continents, from South Korea to Jerusalem and eventually to Wales. The narrative thread is admittedly thin. Many video games offer denser plotting. Essentially, we follow Jerry from crisis to crisis. Yet while the story may lack complexity, the action compensates. This is no longer intimate survival horror, it's global catastrophe. When the infected attack, they do so in violent, swarming waves, stacking atop one another, clawing skyward in grotesque towers of flesh. They hurl themselves at barriers with terrifying force. Forster, whose action credentials were once questioned after Quantum of Solace, stages several sequences with impressive control. The assault on Israel, in particular, showcases striking CGI while keeping Jerry at the center of the chaos. And just when you think the scale of destruction has peaked, the film hints that the next confrontation won't rely on sheer numbers, but on something far more calculated. Another undeniable strength is once again Brad Pitt. He proves he can anchor a franchise-sized blockbuster almost effortlessly. Even at an age when many action leads start stepping aside, he brings intensity and subtlety to what is, on paper, a fairly thin character. There's nuance in his restraint and charisma that goes beyond just movie star presence, far more than the tongue-in-cheek, ridiculously good-looking stereotype would suggest. Unfortunately, the supporting cast barely gets room to breathe. Mireille Enos, James Badge Dale, Elise Gable, and Matthew Fox all feel underutilized. Fox's role, in particular, is trimmed so drastically that you might not even realize he's present until the credits roll. It's a reminder of how much reshaping occurred behind the scenes. Speaking of reshaping, the ending. Reworked by Drew Goddard, the finale carries a faint scent of creative uncertainty. The originally planned climactic battle in Moscow's Red Square was abandoned, reportedly due to its thematic implications. In its place, we get a quieter, more contained conclusion. It's not ineffective, but there's an odd tonal shift. A film that begins with global devastation narrows to a tense, almost intimate final confrontation. New additions like Peter Capaldi and Moritz Bleibtreu help anchor this last act and introduce a sliver of hope, yet the scale-down feels slightly anticlimactic. Still, commercially, World War Z accomplished its mission. A sequel was discussed, even envisioned as the start of a trilogy. For all its production turbulence, the film emerged intact and profitable. That alone marks it as a success, even if one hopes any continuation would proceed with greater creative clarity. At its core, the plot remains straightforward. Like most apocalypse tales, it centers on survival. There's nothing groundbreaking in structure, though the writing is competent. The characters may lack depth, but they're generally likable enough to follow. Visually, however, the film excels. The cinematography stands out, giving the chaos a polished sheen. One could argue it might have benefited from a harsher rating. Much of the violence happens off-screen, muting the visceral impact. It's not particularly frightening overall, save for a single well-timed jump scare inside a building that genuinely catches you off guard. The infected themselves are impressively designed, arguably among the most formidable ever depicted. Fast, aggressive, erratic, the opening sequence hits hard, throwing the audience into turmoil without warning. For a zombie blockbuster, it delivers solid spectacle. The ending is somewhat predictable, but clearly positioned with sequel potential in mind. The film feels like a fusion, part 28 Days Later, part Dawn of the Dead, with a dash of the Return of the Living Dead energy. It stands as another chapter in a lineage that stretches back to George Romero and his pioneering Dead trilogy. After decades of undead evolution, one wonders what remains unexplored. Even variations like The Walking Dead have exhausted nearly every survival scenario imaginable. There are moments that linger, intentionally or not. The eerie irony of first-class passengers overwhelmed mid-flight, the towering walls meant to keep danger out only amplifying it. A fleeting, chilling image of a dying man's eyes snapping back into focus, an unmistakable nod to earlier genre classics. Yet despite these flashes, the relentless scale sometimes dilutes the dread. When characters dispatch infected with mechanical efficiency, tension erodes. Strip away the title and its literary associations, and what remains is a slightly above-average blend of action and horror, competent, entertaining, but not transformative. The spectacle is large, the execution polished, yet something essential feels just out of reach, as though the genre itself is waiting for its next true reinvention. What the film absolutely captures is that raw, grounded chaos of a modern outbreak, the suffocating panic, the confusion, the paralysis of ordinary people caught at ground zero. It feels immediate, tangible. For a while, it nails that gritty realism, but as the scope widens, it starts to overextend itself. Jerry Lane gradually transforms from skilled investigator into humanity's last scientific hope, moral compass, and full-blown action hero all at once. It feels as though multiple roles from the novel were compressed into a single figure for the sake of streamlining. The result is efficient, but slightly artificial. The story briefly flirts with deeper political and social commentary, echoing the thematic backbone of World War Z, yet those moments feel more like gestures than meaningful exploration. The film seems far more comfortable flooding the screen with collapsing skylines and shrieking, sprinting swarms. And to be fair, those swarms are executed impressively. At times the spectacle is intense, even strikingly memorable. But when the third act arrives, the narrative momentum tapers into something predictable. Functional, yes, but lacking surprise. I find myself torn. On one hand, the tension keeps you engaged. You want to see how it all unfolds. On the other, it edges uncomfortably close to I Am Legend, a film that arguably handled isolation and emotional weight with more depth. Director Mark Forster deserves credit for crafting a believable global crisis, and the visual effects often shine. Yet the pacing creates an odd illusion. It feels longer than it is. What's missing is emotional resonance. Will Smith's bond with his dog in I Am Legend grounded that apocalypse in heartbreak? Here, characters rarely pause to acknowledge what they've lost. There's little grief, little reflection. The intensity rarely gives way to vulnerability. It's competently made, performances are solid across the board, but the emotional undercurrent is faint. Pitt plays Jerry with steady focus, though at times that restraint borders on monotony. Given the stakes, a touch more personality, fear, wit, desperation might have elevated the role. The burden of the narrative rests squarely on him, and while he carries it capably, the ensemble barely has space to breathe. for a story about global catastrophe, it often feels surprisingly narrow. The production clearly had confidence behind it. With a reported budget of around $190 million and a worldwide gross surpassing $500 million, audiences showed up. Commercially, it delivered. Culturally, however, it may not endure as a genre landmark. My rating shifts depending on the day. Sometimes I lean generous, sometimes more critical. Today, I'm inclined to view it favorably. In an era dominated by The Walking Dead and an oversaturated zombie market, this film distinguishes itself through scale and action rather than slow-burn horror. The premise is straightforward. A virus turns victims within seconds. The dreaded Z word looms large, though amusingly, the protagonist's family remains almost unnervingly composed amid New York City's collapse. Structurally, it's a familiar A to B to C quest for answers. But along the way, the set pieces, from rain-soaked South Korea to dust-choked Jerusalem, are undeniably gripping. It's highly watchable, maintaining momentum across its runtime. The CGI crowds can look artificial at times, especially the human hordes, but their movements are creatively unsettling, teeth chattering, limbs twitching, bodies diving headfirst off rooftops like grotesque projectiles. Pitt anchors each scene with subdued intensity. Humor is replaced by quiet determination, and it mostly works. The WHO staff members add texture, though many other characters are sidelined too quickly. What frustrates more are the convenient plot mechanics. Trouble seems magnetically drawn to Jerry wherever he lands. Whether it's fate or formula, it feels engineered rather than organic. The film thrives on spectacle, yet relies heavily on coincidence. And just when you think the chaos has peaked, another neatly timed complication emerges, almost as if the outbreak itself isn't the only thing spreading uncontrollably. I still can't quite shake my mixed feelings about it. Even so, it remains entertaining for what it is. It's polished, competently assembled, and consistently engaging, just weighed down by a handful of irritations I can't entirely overlook. The premise is straightforward. A fast-moving viral outbreak engulfs the globe, and one man agrees to trace its origins in exchange for his family's protection. Without leaning too heavily on comparisons to World War Z, it's fair to say that the film's impact arrives at a time when zombie and pandemic stories are already crowding the market. Saturation dulls the shock factor. Still, under Mark Forster's direction, the scale feels undeniably epic, broad in geography and ambitious in spectacle. Forster makes the smart choice to center the film firmly on Brad Pitt. As former UN official Jerry Lane, Pitt brings a steady gravitas to the role. While an unknown actor might have added unpredictability, Pitt's presence grounds the chaos. His journey from continent to continent, dodging swarms of twitching infected, gives the narrative cohesion. The supporting cast offers dependable performances, though few linger in memory once the credits roll. The infected are impressively realized. Their movements are sharp, unnerving, and often menacing, particularly when amassed in overwhelming numbers. Makeup effects, though minimal, are skillfully handled. Despite gunfire and explosions, gore is restrained. That choice works both ways. It broadens accessibility, but may disappoint viewers expecting visceral horror. Even so, there's sufficient tension and action to keep general audiences invested. For devoted zombie fans, the film delivers atmosphere and striking imagery, especially those aerial shots of swarming masses moving like disturbed anthills. There's a tangible, on-location authenticity to the production. Though reminiscent of 28 Days Later, and its sequel in the way the infected sprint rather than shuffle, this entry feels sleeker, less intentionally rough around the edges. Some elements are genuinely intriguing, such as the implied communication among the infected and their dormant states. The sound design occasionally adopts an old-school horror restraint, allowing silence and suggestion to carry dread. However, the screenplay often opts for accessible, paint-by-numbers resolutions. Take the Israel sequence, shot in Malta. The delay in identifying the cause of the noise stretches just long enough for viewers to anticipate the inevitable, softening the intended tension. The originally planned Moscow finale, an enormous battle, was famously scrapped in favor of a quieter, more personal ending. In many ways, that decision works better. It aligns with Jerry's grounded, everyman characterization rather than inflating him into mythic heroism. The more intimate conclusion fits the emotional arc that precedes it. Ultimately, this apocalyptic vision stands as a solid, heartfelt addition to the genre, though perhaps arriving too late in an already saturated landscape to feel revolutionary. A sequel, should it ever fully materialize, would need sharper edges and deeper risks to truly elevate the franchise. Going into World War Z, expectations need recalibration. The moment you read Brooks' book or watched the trailers, it's clear the studio aimed for a massive-scale zombie spectacle, and chose established source material as a foundation rather than crafting an entirely original script. Given the novel's documentary-style structure, a direct adaptation would have been nearly impossible to render cinematically. The screenplay reflects collaboration from multiple creative voices: Matthew Michael Carnahan, Drew Goddard, Damon Lindelof, and story contributions from J. Michael Straczynski, and that layered authorship is felt. Despite production turbulence, Forster proves more adept at orchestrating large-scale action than some earlier efforts suggested. Rather than leaning fully into horror, the film positions itself closer to a thriller or survival drama. Suspense, not shock, drives the experience. Jerry works alongside global authorities, racing to uncover a potential solution while scrambling to protect his family whenever danger closes in. His path from South Korea to Jerusalem to Wales serves as a globetrotting framework for escalating tension. There's little hidden beneath the surface. The film functions primarily as an exercise in momentum, propelled by urgency, scale, and spectacle. It may not redefine the zombie genre, but it injects enough energy and polish to keep it feeling momentarily refreshed. And just when you think the formula has revealed all its cards, you're left wondering whether the next outbreak, on screen or off, might finally push the genre somewhere it hasn't dared to go yet. While nothing here reinvents the undead wheel, Mark Forster presents the chaos with enough immediacy that it almost feels new again. He plays cleverly with our expectations, counting on what seasoned zombie fans think they know, then adjusting the rhythm just enough to keep us uneasy. Yes, it often resembles a bloodless cousin of 28 Weeks Later, but it avoids the kind of missteps that would outright insult the genre. Given how dramatically it diverges from World War Z, the film seemed destined for backlash. Add in the infamous production struggles, rewritten final act, extensive reshoots, endless rumors of trouble, and it looked doomed before release. Yet against expectations, it emerged as a polished, large-scale thriller. Not faithful, perhaps, but functional. The premise remains clean and direct. Jerry Lane, Brad Pitt, a former UN investigator living quietly in Philadelphia, is thrust back into crisis mode when reports of strange global incidents explode into a full-blown outbreak. The U.S. collapses into panic almost overnight. Jerry secures his family's evacuation to a Navy vessel, but their safety comes with conditions. He must retrace the origins of the infection. His mission takes him from South Korea to Israel to Wales, piecing together fragments of a worldwide catastrophe. One controversial element was the PG-13 rating. The film forgoes heavy gore, yet compensates by doing something many zombie films rarely attempt. It illustrates scale. This isn't a contained outbreak in a mall or farmhouse, it's planetary collapse. We see different nations respond, adapt, and crumble. Forster excels at depicting societal breakdown, from explosive panic to eerie, subdued aftermaths. The opening sequence captures urgency, though its heavy reliance on handheld camera work and rapid editing borders on frustrating. Intended to simulate chaos, it sometimes feels visually overwhelming. Fortunately, later set pieces, particularly the Jerusalem sequence, filmed in Valletta, Malta, restore balance. Watching the infected crest the massive walls and flood narrow alleyways is both visually striking and genuinely tense, even when the CGI wavers. For much of its runtime, the film moves briskly, allowing occasional quieter moments to breathe before slowing slightly in the final act. There's an unusual tonal undercurrent as well, a flicker of dark humor, from accidental self-inflicted tragedy to unsettling behavior inside the World Health Organization facility. Subtle political echoes also emerge. The unification of Israelis and Palestinians during crisis, only for that unity to contribute to catastrophe, invites interpretation. The Mossad subplot, suggesting prior knowledge of the outbreak, opens the door to uncomfortable conspiracy parallels. Perhaps that's reading too deeply, or perhaps it's intentional ambiguity. Tonally and structurally, the film borrows from outbreak thrillers like Outbreak and Contagion, while incorporating shades of I Am Legend. Classic zombie DNA is present too. Echoes of Dawn of the Dead and 28 Days Later surface, especially in the third act. There are even faint parallels to War of the Worlds in its portrayal of frightened children and whispered rumors spreading faster than facts. Viewed simply as a global-scale blockbuster, it's more entertaining than its troubled history suggested it would be. Hardcore fans of the novel or purists of the horror genre may struggle with its deviations and restraint, but approached on its own terms, it functions effectively as a fast-moving disaster thriller. That said, not everyone will be convinced. Some may find the narrative cohesion lacking. Jerry's globetrotting investigation causes frequent location shifts, which can fragment the story's flow. The constant jumping between countries sometimes makes the structure feel episodic, rather than organically connected. And as the film races from one crisis zone to the next, the question lingers: are we witnessing a cohesive journey toward salvation, or just a series of escalating set pieces stitched together in the hope that momentum alone can outrun the cracks forming beneath it? There's an undeniable realism in the idea that solving a true global pandemic would require international cooperation, multiple labs contributing fragments of a larger solution. That part rings true, but translating that procedural complexity into compelling cinema is another matter entirely. Instead, the film streamlines the process by sending Jerry Lane, played by Brad Pitt, on a globe-spanning scavenger hunt for answers. The result is a narrative that feels episodic, hopping from crisis to crisis, propelled by bursts of action and explanatory dialogue. Ironically, when the story pauses and remains in one location long enough to breathe, its quality noticeably improves. The tension sharpens, the zombie encounters become more intimate and more frightening, and credit where it's due, the infected here are impressively conceived. They retain enough classic traits to feel authentic, yet incorporate clever upgrades that enable striking, almost surreal imagery. Pitt holds the screen effectively, and the final stretch offers an intriguing resolution, though it takes its time getting there. Unfortunately, much of the earlier journey feels like build-up waiting for that stronger final act. As it stands, the film lands somewhere slightly below average as a popcorn spectacle, redeemed by flashes of creativity. Devoted zombie fans may extract enjoyment from it. Casual viewers might find stronger entries elsewhere. The story begins with chaos in Philadelphia, where Jerry and his family scramble to escape as the infected overwhelm the city. They're eventually rescued by Deputy Secretary General Thierry Umutoni, Fana Makona, and relocated to a U.S. Navy vessel. There, Jerry learns that virologist Dr. Fasbach, Elise Gable, suspects the virus originated in South Korea. Jerry's expertise in field operations makes him the ideal escort. Initially resistant, he's pressured into accepting the mission when informed that his family's safety hinges on his cooperation. Breaking the film into strengths and weaknesses might be the clearest way to assess it. The good. The pacing rarely drags. Even when the structure feels fragmented, it keeps moving. Jerry is portrayed as a genuinely decent man, a reluctant hero motivated not by glory but by protecting his family. That foundation helps the audience invest in him. The script attempts originality in how the infected are ultimately handled. Plausibility aside, at least it strives for something different rather than recycling the usual headshot solution. The camera work, especially in the early outbreak scenes, is frequently disorienting. Handheld chaos and rapid cuts blur together, sometimes inducing more frustration than immersion. The ending, while interesting in concept, feels abrupt, as though it arrives sooner than expected. Sequel bait, perhaps. Character development suffers from the relentless pace. Supporting figures rarely evolve beyond their immediate function. And then there are moments that strain credibility. A zombie inexplicably stows away on a commercial flight, unnoticed until dramatically revealed in a bathroom stall. Even granting cinematic license, it's a stretch. More implausible still is the grenade sequence mid-flight, an explosion creating a conveniently survivable breach rather than catastrophic destruction. It's a spectacle-first decision that undercuts realism. In the end, World War Z isn't disastrous, but it's far from exceptional. It's dotted with logical leaps and thin characterization, buoyed primarily by its scale and leading performance. When it focuses on tension within confined spaces, it works remarkably well. When it leans too heavily on coincidence and spectacle, the cracks show. And just as you begin to decide whether those cracks are forgivable, another swarm crashes into view, daring you to suspend disbelief one more time. It undeniably draws inspiration from 28 Days Later, yet it still stands as a reasonably solid entry in the genre. It's the kind of film you watch, enjoy in the moment, and likely don't revisit often. Years after Max Brooks penned his imaginative and unsettling apocalyptic novel World War Z, director Mark Forster brought a cinematic reinterpretation to global audiences under the same title. World War Z, the premise centers on Jerry Lane, Brad Pitt, a former United Nations investigator summoned to travel the world in search of answers as a mysterious virus transforms humanity into ravenous infected. Governments falter, militaries struggle, and Lane moves from continent to continent seeking fragments of insight. In South Korea, he encounters a jailed CIA operative portrayed by David Morse. In Israel, towering defensive walls and advanced weaponry prove insufficient against overwhelming swarms. Gradually, Lane uncovers a counterintuitive biological weakness, nature's own paradox. Armed with that realization, he ventures into a nearly abandoned research facility, undertaking a desperate, high-risk maneuver that pushes tension to its peak. The film thrives on scale, massive crowds, sweeping global collapse. Panic rendered on an apocalyptic level. For viewers seeking adrenaline and spectacle, it delivers. It paints a harrowing picture of how quickly civilization could unravel, and for many, that's enough to warrant recommendation. Yet not everyone is convinced. Given its enormous budget and the hype surrounding it, some expected a far more visceral experience. The PG-13 rating tempers the brutality, muting what could have been an overwhelming descent into horror. A crisis of this magnitude might have justified a more uncompromising tone. Aside from a handful of spectacular swarm sequences, where crowd panic feels frighteningly authentic, several scenes dial down the intensity to the point of feeling restrained. Criticisms vary. One moment has lain sprayed with infected blood yet unaffected, raising questions. The film's emphasis on the wholesome Lane family dynamic can feel overly polished amid global devastation. The rapid construction of Jerusalem's colossal wall strains plausibility, and its eventual failure underscores the futility of such grand gestures. Some viewers even find Jerry himself an unconvincing savior, less a strategic mastermind, and more a reluctant figure onto whom the world's hopes are improbably projected. Still, others see the film differently. Despite deviating sharply from its source material, it functions as a credible thriller, part globetrotting adventure, part medical procedural. Pitt's performance anchors it with steady resolve. The infected themselves blur genre lines, not traditional undead, but something closer to rage-driven carriers. Infection spreads within seconds. They respond to sound and vitality, almost predator-like, less shambling corpse, more biological weapon. That hybrid identity becomes one of the film's most intriguing elements. These aren't zombies in the classic mold. They're accelerated, volatile, relentless. And as Jerry pieces together the logic behind their behavior, the line between survival strategy and scientific gamble grows thinner. The collapse begins without warning. Jerry Lane, portrayed by Brad Pitt, is driving his daughters to school and his wife Mireille Enos to work through Philadelphia traffic when everything grinds to a halt. A sudden standstill. Sirens, vehicles slamming into one another. Police scrambling. Then the wave hits, infected civilians flooding the streets in a frenzy, chasing anyone still breathing. The escalation is swift and chaotic, and within minutes the family is fighting to survive. That chain reaction propels them from urban gridlock to evacuation, eventually landing aboard a ship in the North Atlantic, where the United Nations has established a floating command center. Through Deputy Secretary General Thierry Umutoni, Fana Makona, the UN recruits Jerry back into action. They believe he's uniquely qualified to uncover both the origin of the infection and a potential way to stop it. What follows is a breathless itinerary: South Korea, Israel, Wales. The pace rarely slows. One sequence, eerily reminiscent of The Thing, features Jerry and a military escort silently pedaling bicycles toward a grounded aircraft, careful not to make a sound that might attract the infected. It's an unexpectedly tense moment. Something as simple as riding a bike becomes an exercise in survival. Fans of Max Brooks's novel should know that the film discards the book's interview-style narrative in favor of a direct, action-driven structure. Initially, that shift may jar purists, but on screen, the streamlined approach arguably heightens suspense. A faithful adaptation might have been intellectually richer, yet less cinematically urgent. Pitt excels here. He doesn't portray a hardened super soldier. Instead, he's an everyman, resourceful but vulnerable, capable yet clearly overwhelmed. That physical and psychological fragility adds texture. Pitt's versatility has long been evident: hero, villain, rogue, strategist, and he never seems miscast. He anchors the film completely. The momentum is relentless. While that speed might suggest narrative thinness, the opposite is true. The plot is dense, almost overly so. Thankfully, the screenplay avoids bogging down in exhaustive explanations. It keeps secondary characters and procedural minutiae lane, maximizing runtime efficiency. Whether or not one considers these infected true zombies is beside the point. The film functions as a sharp, adrenaline-fueled thriller with an intelligent script and a commanding lead performance. And yet, not all viewers remain convinced. The film opens with powerful apocalyptic imagery, humanity on the brink, an unstoppable disease transforming the population with terrifying rapidity. But as the story progresses, some argue that the menace begins to erode. What starts as chilling devolves, at times, into something bordering on absurd. The infected, gaunt and twitching, sometimes resemble the severely ill more than monstrous predators. Their spasms and jerky movements, what one might jokingly call the twitch, risk undercutting the horror they're meant to embody. In certain chaotic scenes, the frantic motion and noise veer toward unintentional comedy. Bodies collide. Crowds scramble in exaggerated confusion. The atmosphere can feel less like existential dread and more like slapstick frenzy. Amid all this, Pitt's Jerry remains grimly focused, pressing toward a solution that, without spoiling specifics, leans heavily into high-concept territory. The infected chatter and emit strange vocalizations, suggesting a kind of acoustic signaling system. It's a creative touch, but one that further distances them from classic undead archetypes. As spectacle replaces dread, the central question emerges: has the terror faded into theatrics? And just as the film seems to settle into that uneasy tonal balance between horror and absurdity, it delivers its final gambit, one that will either feel daringly inventive, or like the moment the apocalypse stops being frightening altogether. The infected even sport jagged, protruding teeth, an oddly specific detail that makes their snarling faces more grotesque than decayed. At times, their twitching limbs and exaggerated movements almost verge on parody. Swap in a comedy duo like Abbott and Costello, or even the Three Stooges, and some of the more frantic sequences might feel like slapstick instead of apocalypse. But tone aside, this isn't merely another undead feature. It's constructed as a high-stakes, globe-hopping thriller. Under Mark Forster's direction, the film embraces spectacle without completely losing narrative drive. Rather than confining itself to a handful of survivors in one location, it widens the lens to show entire nations grappling with collapse. That international dimension gives the story a different texture from standard zombie fare. At the center, Brad Pitt grounds the chaos as Jerry Lane, a former UN investigator pulled reluctantly back into crisis response. He's not portrayed as invincible. Instead, his strength lies in resourcefulness and adaptability. The structure moves quickly from one global hotspot to another, emphasizing how fragile systems become under sudden strain. Certain sequences stand out for their tension: the fall of Jerusalem, the mid-air disaster aboard the plane, and the hushed dread of the laboratory finale. The infected, rendered as fast-moving swarms through heavy CGI, feel less like individuals and more like a force of nature, overwhelming, coordinated, almost elemental. Reframing the outbreak as a pandemic rather than a supernatural curse lends the narrative unsettling plausibility. Visually, the film is ambitious. The escape from Philadelphia erupts with urgency. The siege imagery is striking. Even the quieter Who laboratory scenes prove that suspense doesn't always require explosions. When the pace slows, it shows how effective restraint can be. Thematically, the story brushes against ideas of fragility and resilience, how cooperation, intelligence, and adaptability become humanity's only defense. While character development occasionally yields to spectacle, the film maintains emotional engagement through its central performance. It may not redefine the genre, but it succeeds as a blockbuster with thoughtful undercurrents. For many viewers, it's an intense, satisfying ride, one that sparks curiosity about where the story could go next. Forster's versatility is evident when considering his previous work, from the heartfelt drama of Finding Neverland to the espionage intensity of Quantum of Solace. Here, he demonstrates a firm grasp on suspense-driven storytelling. The film often keeps you leaning forward, propelled by heart-racing sequences and mounting urgency. It even echoes the outbreak realism of Contagion, though presented in a more linear, character-focused framework. Unlike traditional horror entries, it avoids drowning the screen in blood. Much of the fear emerges from implication, rather than explicit gore, a stylistic choice that both broadens accessibility and reshapes expectations. And yet, beneath the spectacle, the frantic swarms, and the global stakes, one lingering question remains: was this truly the beginning of something bigger, or merely a glimpse of a world still waiting to fall completely? Leaning away from excessive gore actually works in the film's favor. Focusing on tension rather than splatter gives the chaos a cleaner, more suspense-driven edge. I hadn't read Max Brooks' novel beforehand, though I was aware that World War Z only loosely adapts it and takes considerable liberties. As a standalone screenplay, it holds together well enough, but the real adrenaline rush comes from watching those lightning-fast infected pursue Brad Pitt across continents. Jerry Lane is introduced as a retired UN investigator enjoying domestic calm, making breakfast, shuttling his wife Karen, Mireille Enos, and their daughters through an ordinary morning. That normalcy evaporates within minutes. A viral outbreak spreads with terrifying speed, transforming people in seconds. These aren't lumbering relics of classic horror. They're quick, reactive, and disturbingly coordinated. Thierry Umutoni, Fana Makuna, Jerry's former superior, pulls him back into service. As one of the UN's most experienced field operatives, Jerry is tasked with tracing the origin of the infection in hopes of discovering a preventative solution. His investigation carries him from South Korea to Israel and eventually toward a crucial laboratory setting. Along the way, he gathers fragments of insight from various secondary characters, including Sejan, an Israeli soldier portrayed by Daniella Kert, who becomes a capable ally. The film opens explosively, arguably stronger than it concludes, but the momentum rarely disappears. It's packed with large-scale suspense and near-constant urgency. Even without extensive character backstory or detailed explanation of the virus's origins, it remains highly engaging. Despite well-publicized production troubles, director Mark Forster delivers a polished, visually striking thriller that exceeds expectations, provided you don't walk in anticipating relentless gore. In fact, it plays less like traditional horror and more like a pandemic-driven action thriller. The outbreak erupts almost immediately, within minutes, leaving little time for deep character establishment before chaos descends. Some viewers may question Jerry and Karen's relative composure amid collapsing city streets. Their calm is partially contextualized later. Jerry's prior UN experience explains his ability to act decisively under pressure. Still, the film favors momentum over introspection. The Israel segment stands out in particular. Watching infected bodies stack atop one another, swarming upward like ants to breach an immense wall, is both visually inventive and unsettling. The mid-air disaster and the tense WHO laboratory sequence, complete with a particularly sharp-toothed, infected lurking in confined corridors, further reinforce the film's blend of spectacle and suspense. It's important to adjust expectations. This isn't The Walking Dead in cinematic form. It's cleaner, faster, more focused on containment and response than lingering dread. The horror elements are subdued. CGI spectacle often replaces practical gore. That may disappoint purists, but works within the blockbuster framework. From the moment Jerry notices something wrong in the streets, people sprinting, vehicles colliding, strangers convulsing and attacking others, the film rarely eases its grip. The UN's swift helicopter extraction underscores his continued value to global leadership. He may have left the organization, but when the world fractures, he's still considered indispensable. And as helicopters lift off, cities crumble and nations scramble for answers, one thing becomes clear. The outbreak isn't just spreading across borders, it's accelerating towards something far more uncontrollable. But before any globetrotting investigation can begin, Jerry has to survive the first night. After barely escaping the chaos in Philadelphia, he and his family are transported to a massive aircraft carrier where military command has taken control. The president has reportedly been attacked. Governments are collapsing. And somehow, despite the murky explanation of his exact former role at the UN, Jerry is deemed indispensable. Through UN official Thierry Umutoni, Fauna Makuna, Jerry is handed a mission. Escort a virologist to trace the origin of the outbreak. Their first stop is South Korea, the earliest location where the term zombie surfaced in intercepted communications. What follows is one of the film's more unexpectedly sharp turns. The scientist meets a sudden, almost darkly ironic end, though not before delivering a thoughtful monologue about nature's ruthless balancing mechanisms. At a U.S. military base, they learn of a patient who attacked medical staff and soldiers, igniting the chain reaction. The trail then leads to Israel, where intelligence suggests the government anticipated the crisis early enough to erect a massive defensive wall. Jerry heads there, meeting an Israeli agent who outlines the nation's worst-case scenario doctrine, taking even the faintest threat seriously. The first whispers of the undead reportedly came via message from India. Then comes the turning point. Celebration and amplified sound inadvertently draw the infected, who swarm and scale the towering wall in one of the film's most visually striking sequences. As chaos erupts, Jerry pushes toward the airport, aiding a wounded Israeli soldier along the way. When his pilot flees, he commandeers another departing aircraft. Mid-flight, an infected stowaway emerges from a lavatory, triggering panic at 30,000 feet. Jerry's drastic solution, a grenade detonated inside the plane, results in a catastrophic yet survivable crash conveniently near a World Health Organization facility. At the lab, Jerry tests a theory born from observation rather than brute force. While the film never truly explains the outbreak's origin, it offers a bold and unconventional solution. Whether one finds it clever or contrived depends on tolerance for high-concept storytelling. The movie launches with momentum, but for some viewers, loses narrative sharpness as it progresses. Dialogue thins. Character exchanges grow less memorable. The infected behave like feral, hyper-aggressive beings, less undead specters and more rabid predators, flinging themselves at victims with almost superhuman force. At times, the CGI veers toward artificiality. Still, there is at least one well-executed jump scare that jolts the entire theater. Critics argue the film overstays its welcome, devoting too much time to Jerry's family rather than deepening its global crisis themes. Others feel the ideas are strong but inconsistently executed, a smart premise wrapped in uneven scripting. Viewed strictly as a disaster thriller, it has undeniable strengths. The Jerusalem siege, the airborne catastrophe, and the tense WHO facility sequence in Britain are standout set pieces. The infected's behavior, spasmodic, animalistic, almost insect-like in their swarm formations, adds a distinct visual identity. Their regression from human to instinct-driven organism underscores the film's pandemic framing rather than traditional undead mythology. The structure, however, can feel episodic, jumping from the US to Korea, to Jerusalem to Nova Scotia, with little connective tissue beyond Jerry's presence. Some performances feel subdued, even detached. The lab scenes evoke a faint procedural eeriness, reminiscent of confined clinical horror settings. Certain visual motifs linger: Pitt racing up stairwells, the aerial views of cities under siege, the ominous stillness before another swarm crashes forward. At its best, it's a slick, large-scale B-movie concept elevated by blockbuster resources. At its weakest, it feels fragmented, rushing through events without always earning their weight. And just when you think the film has exhausted its supply of escalating disasters, it leaves you with one lingering uncertainty. Was this humanity's narrow escape, or merely the opening move in a conflict that never truly became a war at all? There are moments that genuinely work. Watching Jerry fight his way through a crumbling building alongside a small team, scrambling toward a rooftop extraction as a helicopter hovers above, delivers exactly the kind of high-stakes intensity you want from a film like this. When the action clicks, it really clicks, but reactions to the characters are far more divided. Mireille Enos' Karen doesn't resonate with everyone, while Daniella Kert as Sejan often emerges as a standout presence, composed, capable, and visually striking as Jerry's Israeli counterpart. Some viewers even consider her the most consistently likable character in the film. Others in the ensemble, Fana Makuna, Elise Gable, Peter Capaldi, and Pierfrancesco Favino, receive mixed reactions, often due less to performance and more to how thinly their roles are written. Criticism frequently lands hardest on the screenplay. The philosophical speeches, the young scientist musing about nature's brutal efficiency, the Mossad official explaining the 10th man doctrine, can feel heavy-handed. The Jerusalem wall sequence is visually spectacular, yet logically shaky. A city capable of constructing such an enormous barrier somehow fails to anticipate the obvious vulnerabilities. When the infected swarm over it, the imagery is powerful, but the setup invites scrutiny. The film's ultimate solution proves especially divisive. Jerry's realization that terminal illness renders a person invisible to the infected leads to deliberate inoculation with serious pathogens. It's bold in concept but controversial in execution. For viewers with medical training or even a passing familiarity with epidemiology, the idea raises uncomfortable questions about containment, side effects, and global consequences. The script treats the discovery as a breakthrough without deeply interrogating its feasibility. It's a cinematic solution, dramatic and symbolic, rather than a rigorously scientific one. Visually and technically, however, the production is polished. The score amplifies tension, and several set pieces are undeniably effective. Yet some argue the film resembles a spectacle-first blockbuster, action sequences stitched together across global backdrops, occasionally at the expense of narrative cohesion. Comparisons to large-scale franchise films aren't entirely unfounded. The emphasis on movement, escape, and escalating set pieces sometimes overshadows deeper storytelling. For others, the issue isn't implausibility, but uneven pacing. Brad Pitt remains a compelling screen presence, yet long stretches between major zombie encounters can feel inert. The action sequences and visual effects are solid, but quieter dialogue scenes lack the sharpness needed to maintain momentum. The film hints at greater potential, political nuance, emotional depth, ethical dilemmas, but rarely explores them fully. Expectations also play a major role. The trailer promised sweeping mystery and urban collapse, generating immense anticipation. Learning that the film was inspired by World War Z led many to seek out the source material beforehand, only to discover that the adaptation charted a very different course. For some viewers, that difference is forgivable in light of the spectacle. For others, it's a missed opportunity, an epic-scale disaster movie with flashes of brilliance, undercut by uneven writing and questionable logic. And just as opinions begin to settle, praise for the action, frustration with the script, admiration for the scale, the lingering thought remains. With all that potential on the table, was this truly the definitive outbreak story, or just a rehearsal for something far more devastating still waiting to unfold? One of the biggest surprises for many viewers was realizing that this story, both the novel by Max Brooks and the film adaptation, was actually about zombies. The marketing cleverly avoided showing them outright, building intrigue around an unspecified global catastrophe. Brooks' book, structured as a collection of interview-style accounts from around the world, barely resembles the film's linear, action-driven narrative. By the halfway point of the novel, it's clear that the movie would share little beyond the premise of a worldwide undead crisis, and that assumption proves accurate. World War Z centers on Jerry Lane, Brad Pitt, a character not present in the original book. A former UN operative who retired to focus on family life in Philadelphia, Jerry is thrust back into service when the outbreak detonates across the globe. From there, the film follows his investigative journey, from South Korea to Israel to Wales, as he pieces together clues and eventually tests a risky hypothesis inside a WHO research facility. The final act pivots on whether Jerry can uncover a vulnerability that shifts momentum back toward humanity. I won't dwell on the performances of the child actors, it wouldn't be fair, and truthfully, much of the technical craftsmanship in World War Z is impressive. Mark Forster demonstrates far more control here than he did in Quantum of Solace. The direction is confident, the scale is handled smoothly, and the film rarely feels visually sloppy. Marco Beltrami's score adds a driving, almost retro pulse that enhances the tension, and the cinematography and production design give the apocalypse a convincing, lived-in texture. But that's precisely what makes the weaknesses harder to ignore. The central issue lies in the script. A film of this magnitude needs characters we connect with, people who evolve, fracture, or are changed by what they endure. Instead, we're given archetypes assembled from the most basic templates. Dialogue feels mechanical. Motivations are sketched in broad strokes. No one truly breathes. The pacing compounds the problem. It moves so quickly from crisis to crisis that emotional weight never has time to settle. Scenes that could have been powerful are cut short by the next swarm bursting through a doorway. Within moments, the pattern becomes predictable. Calm noise, chase, escape, repeat. The other major misstep is the film's handling of zombie horror. I use the term loosely because the infected here barely resemble traditional undead. For much of the runtime, they behave like rabid, hyper-athletic humans rather than resurrected corpses. Only halfway through do we see subtle hints that they're meant to be dead. Instead of slow dread or creeping terror, encounters devolve into repetitive sprint sequences. The infected rush in, the heroes run, the camera shakes, and we reset for the next location. With the notable exception of the Jerusalem sequence, many of the action horror beats blur together. Once you realize every 10 minutes will culminate in another frantic escape, suspense begins to erode. Spectacle replaces fear. As someone who genuinely loves zombie horror, that's disappointing. The marketing suggested something fresh, a reinvention of scale and intensity. What we received instead was a technically polished but emotionally hollow blockbuster. Strong visuals and committed performances, especially from Brad Pitt, can only compensate so much for a script that never digs deeper than the surface. Final Thoughts: World War Z is a visually impressive, high-budget disaster thriller that prioritizes spectacle over substance. It delivers adrenaline, globetrotting chaos, and a handful of standout sequences, but it stumbles when it comes to character depth, narrative cohesion, and meaningful horror. The infected are fast and overwhelming, yet rarely frightening. The pacing is relentless, yet emotionally thin. For casual audiences seeking fast-moving entertainment, it may satisfy. For dedicated zombie fans hoping for thematic weight or reinvention, it likely falls short. Rating: 10/10, technically accomplished but dramatically undercooked. Recommended mainly for devoted fans of the cast or large-scale apocalypse films. And perhaps the most unsettling realization isn't how the world ends in this story, but how close the film came to greatness before sprinting past it.